was one of 13 children born to Theodore and Adelaide Mayer, who, born in France, came to this country as young people and settled in Wabasha County. One of their 13 children, Sarah Ann Mayer, was born on February 22, 1859, in their log cabin in Bear Valley near Lake City. Sarah married Theodore Kimm in 1878. Their marriage was blessed with 3 children, Henry, Frederick, and Lena, Mrs. Theodore Hines. Many Lake City folks remember Lena Hines as well as Lena's grandson, Max Hines. 2 years later, in 1880, they moved to Lake City. In 1890, Sarah remembered the year very well. She was an eyewitness to the most tragic maritime accident on the upper Mississippi. It was a pleasant, sun-filled day on July 13th when the Sea Wing, a stern-wheeled rafter, left her home port of Diamond Bluff, stopping in Red Wing, Minnesota, to pick up friends and relatives to visit the Minnesota National Guard members training at Camp Lakeview, just south of Lake City. 215 passengers enjoyed the grand outing. At Camp Lakeview, everyone was picnicking and enjoying their time with the guardsmen as it became hot, humid afternoon approaching evening. Sarah watched the boat leave the campgrounds and battle its way against the storm until it passed the point and she was called out with the rest of the town to render such aid as they could after the Sea Wing was blown back by the fury of the gale and wrecked. She lost several of her friends in the tragedy. The Kimms lived in a cottage on the lakefront where they could watch the passing river scene. In the early days, big log rafts being towed from the North Woods passed their porch and sometimes were broken up by the lake storms. Packet boats and excursion steamers anchored almost in her front yard. In more modern times, her lights guided barges and towboats as well as smaller crafts on the river. When steamboats docked in Lake City in the early 1900s, it was a big event. At the extreme right of this picture is one corner of the Kimm's home. Notice the grain elevator and in the back the Gillette and Eaton foundry, which manufactured the steam engines that were on the steamboats. Further down the stream is the first pier built that in high water was often covered. Sarah, who many folks in Lake City better know as Sarah the Lamplighter, because for 37 years she was the lighter and the caretaker of lights on the pier and the city point of Lake City. This was part of the navigation service maintained by the government, lighthouse service along the Mississippi. Sarah began serving in May of 1900 at the age of 41 when John McMillan was forced to quit because of lameness. At that time, Lake City boasted only a long wooden breakwater, which was a pier built in 1887. That on some stormy nights, the waves used to wash it over threateningly. On more than one occasion, Sarah was almost blown into the dark waters of Lake Pepin. A new concrete pier was constructed sometime later with a fine walk on top, but through advancing years, the relentless waves and shifting ice chucks eventually broke out pieces of it, and much of the pier's length became rough with piles of stones to scramble over. But Sarah, being a conscientious government employee who must have known every inch of the route to the light, continued to pick her way out and back every evening throughout the navigation season. The pier light was a red one, indicating it was a landing place for rivercraft. And the marker light at the end of the city point served to point the way up and down the river to steamers and other vessels. At first, kerosene hand lamps were used. These lamps needed to be lit every evening. So Sarah, the lady with the job, with a large responsibility, every evening at sunset she carried her lantern out on the pier as well as a city point and lit the lamps that stood at each end to warn the barges and the boaters. She also needed to extinguish them each morning. From the time the ice left Lake Pepin, usually in March, until the close of the navigation in November. The latest date for the close of navigation in Mrs. Kimm's recollection was on November 22nd. Then later, more efficient oil lamps were put into service. The fuel oil was carefully measured so that the lights would go out automatically at dawn. Sarah received $11 per month for each of the lights she served, or a total of $22 a month during the navigation season. Though not the only woman light tender on the upper Mississippi, she surely must rank among the most devoted. Many native Lake Cityans will remember seeing her breast a gale as she fought her way resolutely to the tip of the pier to light her lamp. More than one observer felt his heart leap into his throat as this elderly woman stumbled over crumbling rocks in the deepening dark. But Sarah never came to grief. She saw her duty and she did it through all the long years. A benign providence protected her. Even the threat that the government might convert the lights to electricity failed to ruffle her. Electric lights may go out in the storm just when the boys on the river need them most, she said. I guess my oil lamps will keep on lighting the way for the pilots as long as they keep coming up the river. A great honor came to Lake City on August 8, 1934, when President F.D. Roosevelt came to Lake City to dedicate the new harbor. Sarah, who had been wanting to plan her retirement, hoped to talk to the president that day and arrange so that she could retire. The president, arriving in town, drove through a crowd which packed the full length of Lyon Avenue from the Milwaukee tracks to the harbor. The throng was estimated at from 10,000 to 15,000 people. He was there just long enough to dedicate the new harbor and dock facilities and left before Sarah had an opportunity to talk to him. She was told it wouldn't do any good to write to the president, as one of his secretaries would get the letter and he'd never see it. I did so want to talk to him about my pension. I am sure if he tried to scramble out over the rocks to the end of that long breakwater like I've been doing night and morning for 34 years, he'd see that I got my pension. As Sarah grew older, she was thinking longingly about her government pension, and she even attempted to resign. But the government refused to accept her resignation until 1937. Katie Schmidt, as a child of age 8, remembers Sarah Kimm very well. She loved when she could come from the family farm to her grandparents' home in Lake City. Katie would walk down by Ohuta Park to meet friends to play with. One time, as she was walking along the lake, she saw Sarah Kimm. Sarah was going out to light the lamps, and she said she could go with her. Katie walked with Sarah both to the point and onto the pier. She feels very honored that she was able to get to know Sarah. That would have been in about 1934, the same time as Sarah was hoping to learn about her pension.
My name is Katie Meyer, and I met Sarah Kimm different times. I would see her walk down. We lived at 620 Dwelly Street, so we would walk down to the lake down there, and then I would walk over and visit some of my friends that lived in this area. And the boys from school would bring cane poles, and we would fish for sunfish down on the lake. And I couldn't ever take them home because then my grandmother would know that I had been at the lake. Well, anyhow, Sarah Kimm always warned us to be real careful when we were by the lake. She was firm, but she was pleasant with us. And Sarah always wore a long skirt or a long dress and a funny little hat on her head.
Interesting facts. Sarah Kimm lived in the house where now a brick building stands. Nasher's Restaurant is the current business there. When Sarah moved to town, there was no harbor. It was, as city folks referred to as the pond. Therefore, when Sarah walked to the end of the city point, she could have walked straight from her cabin to the point. In 1916, an opening was cut through the north bank, and the pond was dredged to create a boat harbor, enabling her to continue her same route to the city point to light the kerosene lamp. In the early 1930s, there were 6 cabins in the Brown Hotel in the tourist point, at which the light was at the end of that point that she still lit. There were also 2 homes, one which Hank Brewer, veteran harbor master, lived. When the city received a federal public works grant to build docks and widen the entrance to the harbor is when President Roosevelt came to Lake City for the dedication. Donna Halverson's family lived close to the government pier at 714 Main Street, now known as Highway 61.
Really, I remember as a little girl sitting on the front porch looking out at the pier, and I could see this black dot, actually, is about all you could see. It moved very slowly, but every year, every day, she would go out and light the light on the end of the pier. I was 7 when President Roosevelt came to town, and I can remember standing and watching him ride by in this big car. And 7 years old, could have cared less about presidents. You know, it was just another big guy coming through. But they decorated the hotel up. There's a picture of the hotel with greens all around the balcony. They really made a big thing out of it. But yeah, that was the time that all the changes started. The highway and all the riprapping and all of those things started about that time. That's when the change really came.
He left town aboard the Mayo yacht North Star. The city received a grant that year, but Sarah was refused her pension. 1 week after she quit her job of 37 years, she died of a heart attack at home. She was 78 years old. She had never missed a night of lighting the lamps except for illness. She is buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Lake City. There were 3 piers during Sarah's span of service. The first one was 20 feet wide and was in use when river navigation was of great volume. The U.S. government constructed the pier out of timber and stone to protect a boat landing dock in 1890. Because this flooded in high water, a portion of the old cribbing was removed and concrete was added to raise the height 3 feet. The second pier was only 2.5 feet wide, and the present one is 5 feet wide. It was completed as a PWA project. Upon completion of the locks and dams for the navigation system, the pier was elevated another 12 feet to its current elevation.
When L.Y. Lenhart died in 1922, the local Graphic Republican noted that Cappi Lenhart was one of Lake City's most picturesque characters. As a riverman, poet, composer of songs, and writer, he was known all over the state.
I was born on September 29, 1846, near Kittanning, Pennsylvania, and came to Lake City in 1857. I recall that the first regular passenger service across Lake Pepin was established in the closing years of the Civil War by Captain J. Hull of Maiden Rock, Wisconsin, who ran a small sloop-rigged sailboat, the Daisy, from Maiden Rock to Lake City. As early as 1864, sporadic passenger service was operated by various captains to the Wisconsin shores. Just after the Civil War, the city fathers realized that regular ferry service to Wisconsin side was a necessity. In 1871, I helped O.N. Murray build the Pepin, a 26.5-ton propeller-driven steamboat in Pepin, Wisconsin. With Captain Murray and me as the engineer, the Pepin provided passenger service between Lake City to Stockholm, Maiden Rock, Pepin, and Reed's Landing. The Pepin figured in a unique occurrence when on January 1st, 1878, after an untimely thaw, Captain Murray and I ran 4 excursions between Pepin and Lake City. The weather was so warm that several of the party wore linen dusters and straw hats. Unfortunately, the Pepin was sunk by a collision with a packet in 1891, but it was raised and repaired. She closed out her final season as a ferry in 1899. I started piloting the steamboat Varana in 1892. The Varana had been christened by local girls Verna Dow and Anna Seeley. The boat, 8 feet by 50 feet in size, was built in Minneska, Minnesota, of white oak at the cost of $4,000 by the Abrams Boat Works. Often the Varana was used in conjunction with Barge H, which was 12 feet wide and 50 feet long, when it was used to haul horses and wagons. The city paid me a subsidy of $65 per month to operate the Varana. These enamel steel plates here were used on the Varana ferry boat. Elmer Holstom, who became my engineer in 1907, and I ate steak and mushrooms on them back around 1910. On our Sundays off, we often went to Wisconsin and picked mushrooms. Then Elmer fried them on the boiler top. A few close friends of ours also went along on these trips when we played cards and fished. I enjoyed writing poetry, and one of my favorite poems is the Mississippi Waltz, was put to music composed by my friend Julia Rogers. The refrain runs, "You're the grand old beauteous steam that bears our burdens far, with the strength of a giant team as you sweep beyond the bar. In my dreams, our silvery spray leads me back towards your side. Oh, let my cares be borne away on the bosom of your tide."
In 1916, the Varana was sold to Elmer Holstrom, who had been the engineer on the steamer. After converting to diesel power, the Varana was operated until 1933, when it was burned by vandals. Patrick Henry Rahilly was born on March 8, 1832, in Limerick, Ireland. He arrived in New York in 1849, a penniless immigrant boy. By 1854, he had made his home in Minnesota. During his life, he rose to wealth and public acclaim. He served his state as a representative and as a senator. Active in supporting his church, he was knighted by the Pope in 1926. He promoted the cause of Irish independence all his life. Arriving in New York State in 1848 at the age of 16, he spent 2 years as a farmhand in Pennsylvania. During this time, he became a student of Horace Greeley, whose teaching was, "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." He came west to Chicago and then by boat to Milwaukee and finally to Wabasha Prairie, now known as Winona. In May 1854, he then traveled west to Rochester. At that time, the city consisted of one lone log cabin, where he secured employment with William D. Lowry, with whom he remained 6 years. Rahilly was made superintendent of Lowry's bank and a partner in his farming interests. It was in this capacity that Rahilly exercised a hand in planning a town and building its houses. In 1856, he planned and superintended the building of William D. Lowry's house, the first brick dwelling in Rochester. With the money he had saved, he purchased 160 acres in Mount Pleasant Township, Wabasha County. But this he sold after 6 years and purchased a quarter section of land located 5 miles from Lake City. In 1860, Mr. Rahilly was married to Miss Catherine Norton. To this union, 7 children were born. Patrick designed and built a beautiful residence of red brick on the land in 1880. The imposing structure stands 60 by 60 feet square, 2 stories high, and capped by a 10-foot by 10-foot cupola. It was nationally known and considered one of the showplaces of the Northwest. He subsequently erected numerous large barns and other outbuildings, each being lighted with electricity and supplied with running water. Its numerous sunken gardens, tennis courts, and golf course were marked features that won national recognition. The Rahilly farm at one time consisted of a solid block of 1,600 acres and stocked with the finest of thoroughbred stock. Patrick remained on the farm until the death of his wife Catherine in 1910, at which time he sold his property to his daughter Mary, Mrs. James McCahill. Mr. Rahilly then moved to Lake City and purchased the home at 304 South Oak Street. He had always been interested in Democratic politics, and in 1872 he was sent to Minnesota State Legislature, where he served 3 terms as representative, and then followed 2 terms in the state Senate. Being largely interested in agrarian questions, he was always championing the farmers' cause and made a couple of trips to Washington to get relief from what he called unjust freight rates. In 1911, he journeyed to Europe, and while visiting Rome, he was accorded by the Holy Father many distinctions not generally given to a layman. When he was 94, Pope Pius decorated him the knighthood of the Order St. Gregory the Great and presented him with this watch. Knighted by Pope Pius because of his unblemished character and his constructive interest in civic and church matters. Patrick was also the first Knight of Columbus in the state of Minnesota. Always a devout Catholic, Mr. Rahilly has been one of the staunch supporters of St. Mary of the Lake Church in Lake City. His time and money have always been freely given. One of the happiest days of his life and one of the finest acts was the presentation to the church in memory of his wife, the handsome pipe organ, which was dedicated on March 4th, 1924. On the occasion of his 96th birthday, he wrote to the Lake City Graphic Republican, "I have had enough to make me feel surer than ever that the great thing in life is first of all the sense of God's presence, and that everything will have its day and wrong will be righted finally. To repeat, I think that by keeping that constantly in mind, I have been able to do my work every single day, facing every day's labor and going to work with a strong sense of duty and courage, which enables one to face one's task with a sense of justice and humility. One of his favorite poems was Rudyard Kipling's If. I have lost $200,000 all through no fault of my own, but simply by helping other people. And yet I have paid it all without going into bankruptcy. When I sold my farm, I loaned all the money at 5% interest to farmers in Wabasha County and other counties who were paying 6 and 7% interest on their loans. And I am thankful to my God that I am celebrating my birthday without pain or ache, and still am ready to help someone in distress who needs my assistance. Patrick Henry Rahilly, pioneer Minnesotan farmer, legislator, and Lake City's most distinguished citizen, passed away on Monday, January 15, 1931, at his home at 304 South Oak Street after a 3-day illness. He was 98 years old. He is laid to rest in St. Mary of the Lake Cemetery.
Throughout her life, Anna Bingham Underwood was an advocate for the betterment of women, children, families, and rural communities. Her work made an indelible imprint on the parks of Lake City and on the Minnesota State Fair. She was an active leader in the Minnesota Federation of Women's Clubs, the Minnesota State Horticultural Society, and in local organizations, most importantly, the Improvement Club. Anna was instrumental in landscaping Oakland Park, now known as Patton Park, and in getting streets and sidewalks paved, boulevard trees planted, and in establishing a public library. It was Anna who suggested the Dakota word Ohuda as the name for the Lake City waterfront, and Underwood Park is named in honor of her and her husband. Anna came to Lake City as a newlywed in the spring of 1871. She was 23 years old when she married Joseph Merritt Underwood at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Winona. Their wedding trip was the boat upriver. The couple began their life together, sharing a house with Merritt's sister Catherine and her husband Phineas Jewell on a farm that Phineas owned on the outskirts of Lake City. The farm included a nursery founded 3 years earlier that grew trees for the new settlements in the area. While the Jewells traveled the countryside making sales for the nursery, Merritt supervised farming, livestock production, and the nursery operation. The business thrived, especially after 1872, when rail service finally connected Lake City to markets in the rapidly growing West. Although the nursery was Phineas's and Catherine's dream, their time with the business was brief. Both were trained medical doctors, but with their own serious health problems. His were the result of service in the Civil War, and hers from disease contracted while treating patients. She died in 1873, and he in 1878. Phineas left his entire estate to Merritt Underwood. Merritt incorporated the business and renamed it Jewell Nursery. It became an economic engine in the new city of Lake City. Shortly after Catherine died, her parents, Daniel and Chloe Underwood, moved to Lake City, where they lived for the rest of their lives with Anna and Merritt. At about the same time, Anna's young brother Winthrop came to live in her home as well. The household continued to grow with the addition of domestic workers and then with children. In the 5th year of their marriage, Anna and Merritt became parents when their son Jewel was born. Roy followed almost 3 years later. It was reported in the newspaper that one of the strangest as well as saddest incidents on record has occurred at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Underwood. Little Jewel died 7 minutes after his brother was born. He'd been healthy, intelligent, and rosy until in an unguarded moment he ate some unripe fruit, which threw him into a sickness that in a few days caused his death. Anna and Merritt had a 3rd son, Max, in 1880, but he did not survive infancy. At about this time, Anna's mother and sisters relocated to Lake City. Her sister Agnes worked as an accountant for Jewel Nursery. Bertha married newspaperman Oliver Collier and lived in Wabasha for a while, but later divorced and returned to Lake City with her son Winthrop to live for the rest of her life near Anna. Anna herself was born Anna Bigham Sargent in 1847 in Hampton, New York, the daughter of Martin Wheeler Sargent and Harriet Bigham Sargent. For the first decade of her life, Anna, with her mother, lived in the East, while their father, a lawyer, roamed the New West in search of a place to settle his restless spirit. He eventually signed on with a survey crew which took him to Wabasha's Prairie, soon to become Winona in Minnesota Territory. Anna was 10 years old when she and her mother joined her father in Winona. He established himself as an attorney and took an active part in the organization of both the county and the city of Winona. He was the county's first clerk of court, the city's first mayor, and he represented the district as state senator in the legislative session of 1862-63. The family lived on the corner of 6th and Broadway, next to the Episcopal Church and across the street from Central Park. Here, 2 sisters and a brother were born. Anna's father died suddenly in 1866, leaving Anna and her mother Harriet with 3 young children, the youngest only 2.5 years old. Harriet took in boarders and later worked as a librarian. Anna completed her education at the new State Normal School, now Winona State University, that was just a few blocks from her home. She became a teacher for the Winona Public Schools, where she worked until she married Merritt. By the time Anna arrived in Lake City, Merritt had been there for 3 years and was already a leader in local civic activities, the Musical Association, and the newly organized Sons of Temperance Lodge. Both were interests shared by his sister and brother-in-law. All 3 were active in the organization that later became the Minnesota State Horticultural Society. Merritt's active involvement in Lake City continued throughout his life. In 1881, he was elected mayor. He became vice president of the Lake City State Bank in 1893, a position he held until 1922. Anna began her long career of civic involvement as soon as she arrived in Lake City. She shared Merritt's interest in vocal music and soon became active in the Horticultural Society as well. She joined the recently formed Lake City Library Association as a trustee and was elected vice president the following year. Fostered by the ideals of her husband's Quaker family, Anna was an active worker for women's suffrage. In Minnesota, women first gained the right to vote in school board elections in 1874. It was reported in the newspaper that the time for holding the regular annual school election occurred on Saturday evening last at 7:30 o'clock at the old school building. The meeting was largely attended by both ladies and gentlemen, and the proceedings were both interesting and remarkable. Remarkable because it was a new sight to witness the presence of ladies at an election where they were clothed with equal rights and privileges with the bearded lords of creation. 33 women, including Anna, voted in that election. In January of 1880, Anna and other Wabasha County residents presented a petition to Congress praying for an amendment to the Constitution that the right of suffrage be based on citizenship without any distinction of sex. It would be 40 more years before women had the right to vote. Anna loved plants and was a student of botany. She gained an enviable reputation as a gardener and florist. She joined Merritt as an active participant in the Minnesota State Horticultural Society. Members promoted the development of northern hardy varieties of fruits. Merritt went on to serve as president of the organization and was so heavily involved in the development of horticulture exhibits at the Minnesota State Fair that a main street on the fairgrounds is named for him. At the same time, Anna served on the State Fair Committee of the Minnesota Federation of Women's Clubs. Beginning in 1882, Anna was a frequent speaker at Minnesota State Horticultural Society meetings, and her papers were published in their monthly publication. She became a life member. In the first years, she wrote about gardening, spring flowers, and care of the flower garden. Then, in the winter of 1885, President Smith introduced her as the pioneer orchardist of Minnesota, and she disclosed that she had been managing the apple orchard at Jewel Nursery for several years. She had also taken up the work of growing small fruits, such as strawberries, raspberries, and grapes. By 1882, she had 1,000 grapevines. In 1899, Anna's presentations to the Horticultural Society turned to the topic of town, village, and country improvement. Anna always took a keen and active interest in Lake City's development. She was active in the early organization of Lake City Parks and Lakewood Cemetery. She was a member of the Lake City Woman's Club from its inception in 1894 until her death. But it was her work as a member of the Improvement Club that transformed the landscape. A group of women organized enhancement projects in Lake City. They did it because, although nature had done much for the town in the way of a most beautiful lake surrounded by picturesque bluffs and valleys, there was much found to offend the sight. The Improvement Club had little money, but plenty of ideas and a certain amount of influence. Apparently it was enough, as the group went on to carry out flower planting projects, sodded and beautified the school grounds, enhanced the train depot, and more. As the group gained enthusiasm, courage, and clout, they took on increasingly larger projects. They persuaded the town to create a park board, assuring a public voice for parks and recreation areas. In their 5th season, the street committee, comprised of 3 successful businessmen who worked as though they were drawing a large salary instead of much criticism, graded and improved city streets. Anna was the first regent of the Lake City chapter of the Minnesota Daughters of the American Revolution, and she was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. The success of the nursery and the Lake City State Bank afforded the Underwoods a lifestyle of wealth. They lived in Oakhurst Mansion on the grounds of the nursery, had household staff, which allowed them time to pursue their business and community interests. Anna was raised in the Episcopal Church and was an active parishioner for many years at St. Mark's in Lake City. Merritt's family were typical New York Quakers, and his brother-in-law Phineas belonged to Lake City's first group of free thinkers. With these various religious ideas combined under the same roof, Anna lived in sympathetic interest with them all. In the 80s, she was for a while interested in Christian Science. In the 90s, she became involved with the modern theosophical movement. So enthusiastically did Anna and Merritt attach themselves to the Theosophical movement that they gave their home and the entire Jewel nursery property to the organization in 1919, with the understanding that it would become a school. They relocated to a bungalow in a Theosophical Society community in Point Loma, San Diego, California. The plan for a school in Lake City never moved forward, though, and the Underwood's property was returned to them. They moved home to Lake City. Meanwhile, Anna's son Roy had taken over management of the nursery. With his wife Florella, they lived in the Underwood family home and had a son, Julian. Anna's mother and both sisters had died. Her brother moved to San Francisco and started a family. Merritt died in 1922. Anna's girlhood friend, Myra Kimball Gladney, who taught school with her in Winona, had become a member of the Underwood family. Anna died in her son's home in 1929. Her ashes are interred at Lakewood Cemetery alongside other members of the Underwood, Sargent, and Jewell families.